So we've talked a lot about square roots in other learning objectives. Now we're going to finally use them to help us solve equations. All right, so say we're trying to solve this equation, x squared equals 4. All right, what are the possible answers for x? All right, what could I plug in for x to make this equation true? Well, one thing you might figure out is that the answer 2 is going to work. I guess 2 times 2, so if I plugged in 2 squared, I get 4. But it turns out there's another answer as well. The other answer is negative 2, because if I do negative 2 squared, I also get 4. So I could plug in 2 or negative 2 into this equation to get 4. All right, so this is one important thing to remember. When you have something squared and you go to a positive, you actually get 2 separate answers. All right, so how are we going to use square roots to solve equations? Well, a square root is the opposite of the second power. So when I have something being squared, I can take the square root of it, and those two things cancel and just give me x. So square root and squared are opposites, and we're going to help them use those to help us eliminate squares in an equation. All right, when we're doing this, there's a couple important things to remember. All right, it's only going to work to eliminate the exponent if it's the only thing on one side of the equation. So I have to get that exponent completely by itself first. Another thing, like we mentioned in a previous slide, is that you get these two different answers. So whenever you take the square root, you're going to have to get this plus and minus. As maybe the first time you're seeing a plus and minus. It basically means there's two different answers. One answer is if you choose the plus sign. The other answer is if you choose the minus sign. But it's just a convenient way of writing it, plus and minus, making both your answers in kind of one expression. All right, for now, you're not going to be able to take the square root of a negative. We'll learn about how to do this later. But if you can't square something to get a negative number. All right, so for right now, if you get a square root of a negative, it's just not possible. All right, so how are we going to do this? All right, we want to solve x squared minus 16 equals 0. All right, the first step is to get the exponent by itself. So we have to get this x squared term by itself. The way we do that is adding 16 to both sides. And now we have x squared by itself. How do we get rid of the squared? We take the square root of both sides. And like we said, the squared and the square root cancel, so that just gives me x. On the right-hand side, I took the square root of an equation, so I have to get that plus or minus, which is telling me that there's two different answers. And the square root of 16 is 4. All right, so I could plug in positive 4 or negative 4 into this equation, and it would be true. Again, this one's similar. We want to get x squared by itself, so I'm going to subtract 125 from both sides. Now I want to take the square root to get rid of the exponent. So our x is going to be plus or minus the square root of negative 125. And for right now, we can't take the square root of a negative number. All right, so in this case, we say, all right, we're trying to take the square root of a negative number, so this equation has no solution. All right, so whenever you're trying to take the square root of a negative for right now, you just kind of stop at that point and say your equation has no solution. Again, the goal when you're doing these types of problems is to get the x squared by itself. So in this case, I have to add 48 to both sides first. 2x squared equals 48. And I also got to get rid of this 2. So the next thing I have to do is divide both sides by 2. So x squared equals 24. All right, so this is the kind of first step when you realize, all right, I'm going to try to solve this equation using square roots, is to get it to look like this. All right, your squared equals a number, and now I take the square root of both sides. The x is going to get plus or minus the square root of 24. And we can simplify the square root of 24. All right, 24 is 4 times 6. And again, that 4 can come out of the square root as a 2. All right, so my final answer is the positive and negative 2 square root of 6. All right, and again, if you needed to, you could put that in a calculator to get a decimal. All right, but for now, I want you to kind of leave your final answer with the square root. All right, 2 square root of 6, positive or negative, is the final answer I would want to see. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. Negative 2x squared plus 16 equals 0. And here's the answer I got. So I subtracted 16 first. And then again, it's really important you keep track of your negative signs. So I'm subtracting 16, so it's a negative there, and dividing by -2. So that negative and that negative cancel to give me +8. So this problem is possible. X squared equals +8. I take the square root of both sides and simplify my square root. And again, don't forget the plus or minus. So plus or minus 2 squared root of 2 is your final answer. Again, the goal when you're doing these types of things is to get this square root by itself. But once you do that, you still might have more steps to do at the end of the problem, whether it's simplifying a square root or still moving some things around. So let's say I was trying to do this one. The thing that's being squared, the squared power is being applied to that whole thing in parentheses. So the thing that's being squared is by itself. So I can already just take the square root of both sides. And again, the square root and square cancel out, which means I'm just going to get x plus 3 on the left. On the right, I'm taking the square root of that number, so I'm going to get plus or minus the square root of 27, which is 9 times 3, so it's plus or minus 3 squared root of 3. But I'm not done yet, because to solve a problem, I need this x by itself. So now the next thing I do is subtract 3 from both sides. And now I have x by itself. And on the right-hand side, I have -3 plus or minus 3 squared root of 3. All right, and it's not possible to combine these because the square root of 3 almost acts like a variable when you're doing like terms. I have 3 square roots of 3. I can't combine that with this -3, which is the number. So I just have to leave these separate. -3 is just the number part, plus or minus the square root part, 3 squared root of 3. All right, so this is the exact final answer you would have to write. All right, here's one with a couple steps before and after. So again, we want to get this thing being squared by itself. So this red box, I kind of want to keep there until I take the square root. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is add 12 to both sides. It's real important you write out your steps so you're not going to forget to do anything. Then I have to divide by 4. 12 divided by 4 is 3. And now I have that thing that's being squared by itself. So now I take the square root. And x minus 1 is going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of 3. We can't simplify the square root of 3 at all, so we're just going to leave it like that. And the last thing I do is add 1 to both sides. So my final answer is x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 3. All right, so just knowing that sometimes there's steps you have to do after you take the square root if you had something more complicated that was being squared. All right, here's one for you to try on your own. All right, and this is the answer you get, but it's actually not the final answer, but this is more similar to the ones we did. So you divide to get the square thing by itself, you take the square root, remember to get a plus or minus, and you subtract 5. But in this case, you can combine these because these are both just normal numbers, there's no square roots involved. So remember that this plus or minus is important because it's saying there's 2 different answers. So I'm going to get 2 different answers. One answer is going to be when I choose the plus sign. So -5 plus 4 is one answer, which is -1. And then -4 minus 4, or if I choose the minus sign, is the other answer, and that's -9. All right, so these are actually 2 answers I can get using that plus or minus, all right, because I can actually combine these because there's no square roots left over. All right, so now go ahead and practice using square roots to solve equations. Again, the most important thing, you get the thing being squared by itself first before you use the square root. And the second most important thing is that you remember to put that plus or minus whenever you take the square root of an equation. All right, that way you get both sides of the answer.